Testing. Can you send it?
Oh, yeah.
Polarized, pyramidal, sweet spot. Everyone wants to know which one is right. But the question misses the point because all of them are built on the same physiological foundations. Welcome back to the Pro Amateur. Today's episode is a deeper one. Training zones, thresholds, and training models. But told in a way that actually connects the dots. You know, we're going to start with physiology, LT1, LT2, VT1, VT2, what they are, how they're measured, and why they matter. Then we'll zoom out into some of the bigger training models everyone loves to argue about, how those metrics fit in, and why they're polarized, why it's pyramidal, sweet spot, and ideally I'll show you how they all actually coexist into real training. No matter what the zone model is you use, 3-zone, 5-zone, 7-zone, everything is anchored around two physiological events. Lactate turn point 1 or LT1 and lactate turn point 2, which is the second shift in the curve. What we also know is that LT1 and VT1 or ventilatory threshold 1 and LT2 and VT2, ventilatory threshold 2, are not arbitrary. They're measurable shifts in how your body produces and uses energy. Okay, LT1 or lactate threshold 1 is the intensity where lactate first begins to kind of rise above the baseline. But more importantly, what it signifies is where your body starts to change how it's meeting energy demand. Ventilation also shifts here. At roughly the same point, your breathing rate and your breathing patterns change. That's VT1. Breaths are going to get slightly deeper, more frequent, but still controlled. The key clarification here is that this is the highest intensity you can sustain while staying primarily aerobic. This is that fat oxidation zone, stress is low, and recovery is quick. This is your zone 2. All right, so LT2 then. And often this is what people mean when they say they're training threshold or at threshold, because at LT2 or also VT2 is when the threshold for that second turn point in lactate accumulation begins. And this is when you also see your lactate accumulate rather than being cleared sufficiently. And at the same point here, VT2 occurs, breathing's more rapid, it's shallow, and it's definitely difficult to control. The key point is that this is not about pain tolerance, it's about your metabolic limits. So traditionally we've estimated these thresholds usually in heart rate or percentage of FTP and power, and while that's okay, it's pretty indirect. It doesn't really meet the specific physiological constraints or profile of the unique athlete. And really, there's emerging work right now, including some ventilatory-based approaches like that the Time War Strap is building, that shows ventilatory thresholds and lactate thresholds align very closely. Again, so we can kind of watch that ventilation and ventilatory threshold shift and give us a good measure of maybe where our lactate is. The key point here is breathing doesn't lie. Power and heart rate are outputs. Ventilation reflects internal metabolic stress. Okay, so don't hear me say that using heart rate or FTP or power to give yourself some degree of where you're at in that metabolic profile isn't a good thing. Sometimes that's what we have. That's the best we have. Again, and it works for almost everybody. But when we guess LT1 or LT2 from FTP, athletes often drift too hard or too easy, especially in what they think is that easy or threshold work zone. This is why zone 2 sometimes feels hard for so many people, and why threshold sessions accumulate too much fatigue, and then we cost us subsequent training days. All right, so with a little bit of an understanding there of how our metabolic profile is kind of built, we can translate that into how we understand zone models and training models. So what we really need to understand is all zone models are just different ways of organizing that intensity around LT1 and LT2. So for instance, the 3-zone model, zone 1 below LT1, zone 2 between LT1 and LT2, and zone 3 above LT2. This is the model that most research uses. Simple, zone 1, 2, 3, or easy, medium, hard. Now in those 5 and 7 zone models, they simply divide the space between LT1 and LT2 into subsequent chunks. This is your tempo, sweet spot, and threshold zones, which is useful for coaching and planning and better understanding what you might be stimulating in your workout. All right, now let's define these three training paradigms everyone loves to argue about and try to make them more clear and simple. All right, so polarized training, or the 80-20 method, popular by a lot of Dr. Seiler's research. That's where the majority of training is below LT1, when there's a small amount of training above LT2, 80-20, and very little time in between. This has some pretty significant research-backed benefits, aerobic development, recovery preservation, long-term performance gains. This is why polarized training shows up so often, time and time again in the literature. Okay, pyramidal training, most of the volume below LT1, a little more volume in LT1 to 2 zone, and then a little bit above LT2. This is what many well-trained athletes naturally do, especially in their base and or performance prep phases. All right, now that threshold or sweet spot training, really that's defined by a lot more time in the middle and maybe a middle just underneath that LT2, just below threshold. There's a high stimulus per hour, but there's also a high fatigue cost, and this can be very effective, especially for time-crunched athletes, but it really requires precision, and it's not the only way to train as a time-crunched athlete. All right, this is the part where I get a little bit frustrated. When people say things like polarized is better or sweet spot is the only thing that works, they create this arbitrary false line in the sand. And in reality, it's almost always an and both situation. All right, are you ready for it? And as always, it depends. What you emphasize depends on your training age, your event demands, your time availability, your durability, where you're at in the season. And here's the key part for most people miss. Almost every well-trained athlete uses all of these training paradigms and it is all the zones at some point across the season. It's about how you put the ingredients in place and bake that together that has the biggest impact. All right, I get it. You're sitting there thinking he's just telling us what he wants to hear and what he thinks and what's worked best for him. But no, really, I think once the zones are defined, the next big question then is how much time should we spend in each? And this is really where we can start to draw a little bit firmer line and cement some of these principles and ideas and theories into place. So what does the research say? All right, so polarized training. A major narrative review by Hydron and Cohen in 2015 looked at training intensities across, different endurance sports. Most long-term performance gains occur when the majority of training is at low intensity with a small amount of very high intensity. They and others land around that 80-20 split. Lots of easy work, very little bit of moderate, and a small amount of meaningful, hard work. All right, well, how about a meta-analysis? For you science nerds, we know this is the one that really anchors it. So in 2019, Rosenblatt and colleagues pooled randomized control trials together comparing polarized and threshold training, or sweet spot training. And what they found was that a moderate advantage for polarized training in time trial performance, with an important caveat. There weren't that many studies that really showed it. So the key point here really becomes, the signal favors polarized training, but it's not an absolute. How about cycling specifically? So in 2013, Neal et al. Compared 6 weeks of polarized training to 6 weeks of threshold focused training. The results? Both improved. Polarized training, though, improved their peak power and lactate threshold more than the sweet spot or threshold training. Really what this means is threshold work isn't useless, but it's more fatiguing for similar gains. So when I say fatiguing, what do I mean? So that autonomic recovery, that nervous system stress that we have to get over is just as important as our physical stress. And in 2007, Seiler looked at that autonomic recovery using heart rate variability. And yes, I know there's other things to measure, but this is what we got. And they found that those low intensity sessions saw pretty quick recovery, while training at threshold and in those harder sessions had delayed recovery. Well, duh. But where that's important is making sure that we keep our easy days easy and our hard days hard, instead of going out there and mixing in chunks of intensity in every day, which is subsequently going to affect our recovery and never allow us the ability to get into those significantly high zones that really have the biggest bang for their buck. So you're probably all thinking that I'm just kind of bashing the pyramidal zone, and I'm not. And actually, here's where things get that nuanced situation. So Stogel and Sperlich in 2015 reviewed both retrospectively and prospectively some data around it. And they found that many elite athletes train pyramidal, okay? So the best do it. But a lot of times in those controlled trials, they found that polarized training produces larger gains in VO2 max and time to exhaustion. So what does this mean? Well, elite athletes do use pyramidal training, and what works best in experiments isn't always the same thing. Again, it's not an and or situation, it's a and both situation. So, and both. Yes. This is where periodization comes into play, and it matters. And it's reinforced here by Philippus et al. In 2022. They had a study, 16 weeks, pyramidal versus polarized. And some of those athletes, two of the groups, switched midway through the study. So they had one group, strict polarized all the way through, one group, strict pyramidal all the way through. One group started pyramidal, switched to polarized, and then another group started polarized, switched to pyramidal. What'd they find? Well, they found that those who moved from pyramidal to polarized saw the biggest improvements in VO2 max and 5K performance. What does that mean? And both. Build capacity first, then sharpen. All right, so a lot of this data findings around elite professional athletes. So what about us pro amateurs, us recreational age groupers? Still matters for us. Study here by Munez and et al. In 2014 studied recreational runners, and they found that both polarized and threshold focus groups improved. The athletes, though, that actually adhered to the polarized prescription improved more. So intensity control matters, but the consistency almost matters more than the plan on the paper. All right, now, how about the complete opposite end of the spectrum from us average Joes? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Jakob Ingebrigtsen and the more popularly coined Norwegian model, which is a pretty special case. The Norwegian model often gets lumped into that threshold heavy training zone, but it's kind of misleading. Now, Marius Bakken described using lactate testing to keep the threshold sessions at that 2 to 3 millimole per liter, not the traditional LT2 4 millimole per liter. So they're hanging out just below that second LT2 VT2 mark, okay? Now, what does that mean? That's a lower stress threshold that's closer to the top of that zone 2 or that lower zone 3, maybe zone 4 shift in a 5-zone model. Now, that's great, but this only works if you can measure it. Otherwise, athletes overshoot and accumulate fatigue. So, complicated case, special use scenario, probably not that important to be that clear cut and honed in for most of us. What does the research actually support? The research we covered earlier tells a consistent story when viewed correctly. Low intensity volume drives an aerobic base. High intensity work sharpens performance. Moderate intensity is powerful but costly. Mixing methods across time works best, or periodizing training paradigms and specific physiological stresses has the biggest impact. Now, again, in reality, it all depends on the person, what they need, X, Y, and Z. But in practice, this usually looks like a base phase with mostly low intensity, pyramidal to polarized distribution, really focusing on aerobic efficiency. Transitioning into a build phase, which is a little bit more polarized or a little bit more pyramidal, with clear separation in those training zones. Now, in that peak phase, we usually see a highly specific, highly targeted intensity specific to the demands of the event, race, whatever you're training for. And that also has an impact on how we're recovering through those. So when we can really be definitive with, again, our zones, LT1, LT2, then we can make that progression very clear and obvious and put the puzzle pieces together appropriately. Let's put a little bow on this. So LT1 and LT2 define all zone models. They're consistent anchors. Ventilatory and lactate thresholds, they align very closely and might be good things to use to help define those zones. Guessing zones leads to unnecessary fatigue and not getting the bang for the buck of the energy and effort you're putting in. Polarized, pyramidal, and sweet spot are tools, not identities. Most successful athletes use all three of those training schemes and work out in all the zones across all seasons, just with maybe a little more here, a little more there. Precision matters more as your training age increases. The more consistent progressive training you've had, the more important it gets to be dialed. But above all else, be consistent. Periodization, aka a good recipe with a foundation in research and individualization, beats dogma. The goal isn't to train like a study. It's to understand what the studies are pointing toward. When you understand thresholds, zones, recovery costs, training stops feeling like confusion and guessing and starts feeling intentionally, like it matters. Next week, I'll walk through a little bit of my 2025 recap and again, kind of how I'm structuring 2026 and the big things we're transitioning and trending towards. Subscribe, like, comment, all the fun things. And as always, train like it matters.